March 18, 1964, and the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab is about to make an announcement that will send shockwaves through a small coal mining town that has lived in the shadow of an unspeakable tragedy for nearly 6 decades. Standing at the podium, with tears streaming down his weathered face, is Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator who spent years of his life chasing a ghost. Beside him are 4 elderly siblings who have waited their entire adult lives for this moment. And what Barron is about to reveal will prove that sometimes justice doesn't forget, it just takes time. The name he's about to say belonged to a man who walked among them for years, a bartender who served drinks and told jokes and lived just 6 blocks away from the little girl whose life he stole on a bitterly cold Wednesday morning. If you think you've heard every possible twist in a cold case story, what happened to 9-year-old Marise Chiverella and what it took to finally bring her killer's name into the light will keep you captivated until the very last word. Let's go back to the beginning, the very beginning, because to understand the magnitude of what was lost on March 18, 1964, you need to know who Marise was before that day changed everything. Marise Chiverella was born into a working-class family in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a tight-knit coal mining community where everyone knew everyone and kids still walked to school alone and felt safe doing it. Marise was 9 years old, with dark hair and bright eyes and a smile that her siblings remember lighting up every room she entered. She was shy, which her family always emphasized, shy and sweet and quiet, but she had dreams that were anything but small. Marise wanted to be a nun. She took her faith seriously, attending Mass regularly, and she was learning to play the organ. She spent her Wednesday mornings before school taking canned goods to St. Joseph's Catholic Church, just a few blocks from her home. The Chiverella family was typical of the working-class families that populated Hazleton in the early 1960s. They were hard-working, devout Catholics who believed in community, in helping others, in raising their children with strong moral values. The streets of Hazleton were safe, or so everyone believed. Parents didn't worry when their children walked to school alone. Neighbors looked out for each other's kids. There was a sense of security, of trust, that would be shattered forever by what happened to Marise. Marise's siblings remember her as a gentle soul, someone who never caused trouble, never raised her voice, never complained. She helped around the house without being asked. She was kind to younger children. She took her studies seriously, and her teachers adored her. In the photographs that survive from her short life, you can see that sweetness in her face, that innocence that should have been protected but wasn't. On the morning of March 18, 1964, it was brutally cold, the kind of Pennsylvania winter cold that cuts right through your coat and makes you want to run, not walk, to wherever you're going. Marise's cousin Helen Slattery would remember decades later seeing Marise hustling past her house that morning, moving quickly against the wind with her arms wrapped around those canned goods for the church. Helen would tell reporters 30 years later that she almost called Marise inside to warm up for a moment, and the guilt in her voice when she said, "I'm so sorry I didn't," would haunt anyone who heard it, because that small act of kindness could have changed everything. The temperature that morning was in the low 20s, and a bitter wind was blowing through Hazleton streets. Most people were hurrying to get indoors, to get to work, to get children to school. The town was waking up. People were starting their days, going about their normal routines. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nobody saw anything suspicious. Life was proceeding as it always did in a small Pennsylvania coal town on a Wednesday morning in March. Marise left her house that Wednesday morning at around 8 o'clock. She was supposed to drop off the canned goods at St. Joseph's Church and then walk to her school just 2 blocks away. It was a route she had walked countless times before, a route that should have been safe in a community where parents still let their children walk alone and where everyone looked out for each other's kids. Marise was wearing a blue dress that morning and a coat to protect her from the cold, and she was carrying those cans of food because that's the kind of girl she was, the kind who thought about others, who wanted to serve, who dreamed of dedicating her entire life to God and to helping people. Her mother had watched her leave that morning, had watched her daughter head out into the cold, had no reason to worry, no premonition of danger, no sense that this would be the last time she would see Marise alive. When Marise didn't show up at school that morning, her teacher noticed immediately. Marise was a good student, the kind of kid who was never absent without reason, never late, never in trouble. As the morning wore on and Marise still hadn't appeared, the school contacted her parents, and that's when the first tendrils of panic began to spread through the Chiverella household. At first, there was confusion. Where could she be? Had she gotten sick on the way to school? Had she decided to stay at the church longer than planned? Was she at a friend's house? Every parent who has experienced even a few minutes of not knowing where their child is understands the sick feeling that begins in your stomach and spreads through your entire body. But for the Chiverellas, those few minutes stretched into hours, and confusion turned to fear, and fear turned to terror. By early afternoon, the entire community was searching for Marise. Volunteers spread out across Hazleton, calling her name, checking every possible place a 9-year-old girl might be, hoping against hope that there was some innocent explanation. Maybe she had gotten lost. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house. Maybe she was hurt somewhere, unable to call for help. Anything seemed better than what everyone was secretly fearing. The search took on an urgency that only comes when a child is missing. Neighbors left their jobs to help look. Store owners closed their businesses to join the search. Teachers, students, factory workers, housewives, everyone who could walk was out on the streets calling Marise's name. The police were notified, and officers began a systematic search of the area, starting with the route Marise would have taken to church and then to school. As the hours passed and there was still no sign of Marise, the fear deepened. The winter sun was beginning to set, and the temperature was dropping even further. If Marise was outside somewhere, if she was hurt and unable to move, she would be in serious danger from the cold. The search continued into the late afternoon, with flashlights and lanterns as darkness began to fall. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man was giving his 16-year-old nephew driving lessons on the outskirts of town, practicing turns and stops and building confidence. They were driving near an abandoned coal mining pit, the kind of place that dotted the landscape around Hazleton, scars left behind by decades of extracting black gold from beneath Pennsylvania soil. The nephew saw something that made him stop the car. At first, they thought it was a large doll lying in the waste pit, just trash that someone had discarded. But something about it didn't look quite right. The teenager climbed down to investigate, and when he got close enough to see clearly, his scream pierced the cold March air. It wasn't a doll, it was Marise. Marise Ann Chiverella had been raped and murdered, and her small body had been dumped in that coal pit like garbage. The canned goods she had been carrying to the church were found scattered near her body, a heartbreaking reminder of the errand of mercy she had been on when she was taken. When the Pennsylvania State Police arrived at the scene, they found evidence that would haunt investigators for the next 57 years. The crime scene was processed with all the care and attention that 1964 technology allowed. Photographs were taken from every angle. Evidence was collected and cataloged. Measurements were made. Witness statements were recorded. The investigators knew they were dealing with the worst kind of crime, the murder of a child, and they were determined to find whoever had done this. The medical examiner's report would confirm what everyone feared. Marise had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. The brutality of the crime was shocking even to experienced investigators. This wasn't a crime of passion or an accident that had gone wrong. This was the deliberate, premeditated act of someone who had targeted a vulnerable child and shown her no mercy. The murder of Marise Chiverella sent shockwaves through Hazleton that reverberated for generations. Corporal Mark Barron, who would eventually solve this case decades later, would say at the 2022 press conference that everyone who lived through it remembered it vividly, and everyone who grew up in the area heard the story from a parent or grandparent or aunt or uncle. The message was always the same. This is Marise's story, and what happened to her changed how we lived. Suddenly, kids weren't allowed to walk alone anymore. Doors that had never been locked were bolted shut. A community that had felt safe and insulated discovered that evil could strike anywhere, even in a small coal mining town in Pennsylvania, even on a Wednesday morning when a little girl was just trying to do something kind. Parents became hyper-vigilant. Children were warned about strangers. The innocence that had characterized life in Hazleton was gone, replaced by fear and suspicion. People began to look at their neighbors differently, wondering if the person who had killed Marise might be someone they knew, someone they saw every day, someone who appeared normal on the outside but harbored dark secrets. The funeral for Marise was one of the largest Hazleton had ever seen. The church was packed with mourners, and hundreds more stood outside in the cold. Father Thomas O'Donnell, who had known Marise from her visits to the church, delivered a eulogy that brought tears to everyone present. He spoke of Marise's kindness, her faith, her dreams of serving God. He spoke of the senseless tragedy of her death and the need for the community to come together in the face of such evil. Marise was buried in a local cemetery, her grave marked with a simple headstone that gave her name, her dates of birth and death, and a brief inscription about her being with the angels. Her family would visit that grave regularly for the rest of their lives, bringing flowers, saying prayers, and wondering if they would ever know who had killed their beloved daughter and sister. The Pennsylvania State Police threw everything they had at the investigation in those first critical days. They interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at every angle and considered every possibility. They had suspects, men whose names came up through tips or whose behavior seemed suspicious or who had been in the area that morning, but they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest. The forensic technology that we take for granted today simply didn't exist in 1964. DNA testing was decades away from being discovered, let alone used in criminal investigations. Fingerprint analysis was available but limited. There were no security cameras, no cell phone records, no digital footprints to follow. Investigators had to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, and old-fashioned detective work. The lead investigator on the case was a seasoned state trooper who had worked dozens of homicides, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional toll of investigating the murder of a child. He and his team worked around the clock, following up on every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. They interviewed everyone who had been in the area that morning, everyone who knew Marise, everyone who had any connection to the case. Several men were brought in for questioning. Some had criminal records. Some had been seen in the area where Marise disappeared. Some had behaved suspiciously in the days after her murder. Each one was thoroughly investigated, their alibis checked and rechecked, their backgrounds scrutinized. But one by one, they were eliminated as suspects. Either their alibis held up, or the evidence didn't support their involvement, or investigators simply couldn't build a case strong enough to bring charges. Among those investigated in those early months was James Paul Forte, the man who would eventually be identified as Marise's killer. At the time, Forte was 22 years old, working as a bartender and living just a few blocks from the Chiverella family. He was questioned, like many other men in the community, but there was no evidence to connect him to the crime. He had an alibi, he said he had been at work, and there were no witnesses who placed him at the scene. Without physical evidence to tie him to the murder, investigators had no choice but to move on to other suspects. The evidence that had been collected at the crime scene was carefully preserved. Investigators in 1964 couldn't have known that DNA technology would eventually be developed, but they followed protocol and made sure that everything was properly stored. Blood samples, fabric samples, Anything that might someday prove useful was cataloged and placed in evidence storage, where it would remain for decades. As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the investigation gradually slowed. Leads dried up. New information stopped coming in. The case went cold, joining the ranks of unsolved murders that haunt law enforcement agencies across the country. But the file was never closed. It remained active, a constant reminder of an unsolved crime and a little girl who deserved justice. But here's what you need to understand about cold cases. They're never really cold to the families who live with them every single day. Marise's 4 siblings grew up in the shadow of her murder. They went to school and got married and had children of their own and lived full lives, but there was always an empty chair at the table. There was always a sister they couldn't talk to. There was always the question that nobody could answer. Who killed Marise and why? And would they ever know the truth? Her sister Carmen Marie Radkek would say decades later at that 2022 press conference that their family had so many precious memories of Marise, but at the same time, their family would always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. She said, "We will continue to ask ourselves what would have been, what could have been," and those questions hung in the air like ghosts. The Chiverella parents carried the weight of grief for the rest of their lives. Marise's mother would sometimes set out 5 plates at dinner before remembering that Marise was gone. Marise's father became more withdrawn, less trusting of the world. They attended Mass regularly, praying for their daughter's soul, praying for justice, praying for understanding of why such a terrible thing had happened to their innocent child. The siblings dealt with their grief in different ways. Some threw themselves into their studies or their work, trying to keep busy enough that they didn't have time to dwell on the loss. Others struggled with depression and anxiety, haunted by nightmares of what their sister must have gone through in her final moments. All of them felt guilty, survivor's guilt that they were alive and Marise wasn't, guilt that they hadn't been there to protect her, guilt that somehow they should have known, should have done something, should have saved her. As they grew older and had children of their own, the siblings were fiercely protective. They never let their children walk anywhere alone. They taught them about stranger danger years before such concepts became mainstream. They made sure their children understood that the world could be a dangerous place, that evil existed, that they needed to be careful. And they told their children about Aunt Marise, the little girl who had wanted to be a nun, who had been taken from them too soon, whose killer had never been caught. Every year on March 18th, the anniversary of Marise's death, the family would gather at her grave. They would bring flowers and say prayers and remember the little girl with the bright smile and the kind heart. They would wonder aloud if this would be the year that answers finally came. And year after year, they would return home disappointed. The case still unsolved, the killer still unknown, the questions still unanswered. The Pennsylvania State Police never forgot about Marise and Chiverella. Even as the years turned into decades, there were always investigators who kept her file active, who reviewed the evidence periodically, who hoped that someday something would break. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Brutowski would later explain that for the first 40-plus years, they worked the case with old-fashioned police work. They went out to interview people, they sent teletypes, they interviewed other people, and it went word of mouth. They never stopped looking for the person who killed that little girl. New investigators would be assigned to the cold case unit, and one of the first files they would review would be Marise. They would read through the witness statements, study the crime scene photographs, review the evidence inventory. Some would develop an obsession with the case, spending their own time trying to find new angles, new leads, new possibilities. Others would work on it for a while before moving on to other cases, but none of them ever forgot Marise. The case became something of a legend within the Pennsylvania State Police. It was the oldest unsolved child murder in the state's history. It was the case that every investigator wanted to solve, but nobody could crack. Senior investigators would tell younger officers about Marise when they joined the cold case unit, passing down the institutional knowledge, making sure that new eyes were always looking at the evidence, always searching for something that might have been missed. As forensic technology improved over the years, the evidence from Marise's case was periodically re-examined. When fingerprint technology became more sophisticated, the evidence was reprocessed. When blood typing methods improved, samples were reanalyzed. Each technological advance brought new hope that maybe this would be the breakthrough that would finally identify the killer, but time and again, the results were inconclusive or unhelpful. The investigators who worked on Marise's case over the decades formed a kind of unofficial brotherhood. They would share information, discuss theories, debate suspects. Some retired without ever seeing the case solved, passing the torch to the next generation with the hope that they would have better luck. Others passed away, taking their knowledge and insights to their graves. But the investigation continued, driven by a collective determination that Marise deserved justice, that her family deserved answers, that whoever had committed this terrible crime should not be allowed to escape accountability forever. The breakthrough everyone had been waiting for began in 2007. That's when the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab was finally able to develop a suspect profile based on DNA evidence that had been preserved from Marise's jacket. Think about that for a moment. Evidence that had been collected in 1964, carefully stored and maintained for over 40 years, was finally yielding results that could identify a killer. The development of DNA profiling technology in the 1980s and 90s had revolutionized criminal investigations. For the first time in history, investigators could positively identify suspects based on biological evidence left at crime scenes. The technique was so powerful, so definitive, that it could link a suspect to a crime with near certainty. And for cold case investigators, DNA technology represented hope. Hope that decades-old cases could finally be solved. Hope that families could finally get answers. When the DNA profile was developed from Marise's jacket in 2007, it was a major step forward. For the first time, investigators had a genetic fingerprint of her killer. They uploaded that DNA profile to the National CODIS database, which is the combined DNA index system that law enforcement uses to compare DNA from crime scenes with DNA from convicted offenders. The CODIS database contains DNA profiles from millions of convicted offenders across the United States. When a new profile is uploaded, the system automatically searches for matches. If the person who left DNA at a crime scene has ever been arrested and had their DNA collected, there should be a match. For investigators working on Marise's case, getting that DNA into CODIS seemed like the beginning of the end. They expected a hit relatively quickly. Surely someone who would rape and murder a child had committed other crimes. Surely he was in the system. But month after month, year after year, there was nothing. The DNA was sitting there like a fingerprint from a ghost, waiting for the right person to be entered into the system, and it seemed like it might never happen. Investigators checked the database monthly, running the profile against new entries, hoping for a hit, hoping for a match, hoping for a name. But the answer was always the same: no match found. This was frustrating beyond measure. They had the killer's DNA. They knew who he was, in a genetic sense. But without a name to attach to that DNA profile, they were stuck. It was like having a picture of someone's face but not knowing their identity. The technology had given them a powerful tool, but that tool was only useful if the perpetrator was in the database, and apparently he wasn't. Some investigators began to despair that they would ever solve the case. Maybe the killer had never been arrested for anything. Maybe he had died before DNA collection became routine. Maybe he was living in another country. There were 1,000 reasons why his DNA might not be in CODIS, and none of them were good news for the investigation. But in 2018, everything changed. This is where the story gets really interesting, because the world of criminal investigation was about to be revolutionized by something that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Genetic genealogy websites like GED Match and Family Tree DNA had exploded in popularity. Millions of people were uploading their DNA to these sites, hoping to find long-lost relatives or learn about their ancestry or build family trees. What those people didn't realize was that they were creating the most powerful criminal investigation tool in modern history. Investigators realized that they could take DNA from crime scenes and upload it to these public genealogy databases. If the perpetrator's DNA wasn't in there, maybe a distant cousin's DNA was. And if you could find a distant cousin, you could build a family tree. And if you could build a family tree, you could narrow down suspects. This technique had just been used to catch the Golden State Killer in California, a serial rapist and murderer who had terrorized the state for decades. For years, the Golden State Killer case had been cold, his identity unknown despite extensive investigations. But in 2018, investigators used genetic genealogy to identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the suspect, and DNA evidence confirmed the match. The case made headlines around the world and demonstrated the incredible power of this new investigative technique. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice. If genetic genealogy could catch the Golden State Killer, what other cold cases could it solve? Suddenly, cases that had been considered unsolvable were being reopened. Investigators who had given up hope were dusting off old evidence and submitting it for DNA analysis. Families who had resigned themselves to never getting answers were receiving phone calls from detectives saying they were taking a fresh look at the case. The Pennsylvania State Police partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology and genetic genealogy company that specialized in using these new techniques for criminal investigations. In 2018, they sent Marise's killer's DNA profile to Parabon, and Parabon uploaded it to public genealogy databases. And they got a hit. It wasn't a direct match. The killer himself hadn't uploaded his DNA to a genealogy website. But they found a very distant relative, someone who shared enough DNA with the killer to indicate they were related but possibly several generations removed. This was exciting, but it was also daunting. What do you do with a distant genetic relative? How do you turn that into an actual name? The match might have been a third cousin twice removed, or a fourth cousin, or some even more distant relationship. The shared DNA was enough to establish relatedness, but not enough to identify the specific individual. It was like being told that someone in a particular city of 1 million people was the person you were looking for. It narrowed things down, but not nearly enough. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the Pennsylvania State Police did something that traditional law enforcement agencies almost never do. They reached out to a 20-year-old college student for help. Eric Schubert was a history major at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, and he ran a small genetic genealogy business called ES Genealogy. He had developed an interest in genealogy as a young boy, fascinated by family trees and historical records, and the puzzle of tracing ancestry back through generations. As genetic genealogy became more popular, Schubert recognized that his skills could be applied to criminal investigations. He had helped other police agencies crack cold cases using genetic genealogy, and he was looking for a new case to work on when he ran across Marise's story online. Something about the case struck a chord with him. Maybe it was the fact that Marise had been so young, or that the case had been unsolved for so long, or that her family had been waiting for answers for decades. Whatever the reason, Schubert reached out to the Pennsylvania State Police and offered his services. This was a bold move. State police agencies are typically insular and protective of their cases. They don't usually work with outside civilians, and they especially don't work with college students who are barely old enough to buy a beer. But something made the Pennsylvania State Police take a chance on Eric Schubert. Maybe it was desperation. They had been working the case for 50+ years without success. Maybe it was recognition that Schubert had skills they didn't have. Maybe it was a willingness to think outside the box, to try something new, to accept help from an unconventional source. Whatever the reason, they accepted his offer, and for the next 2 years, Schubert worked side by side with Pennsylvania State Police investigators on Marise's case. What Schubert did next was both incredibly complex and remarkably simple. He took that distant DNA match and began building a family tree. But this wasn't like the family trees you might have made in elementary school. This was a massive, sprawling, exhaustive genealogical investigation that went back generations and branched out in every direction. Schubert was looking for the common ancestors between the distant relative whose DNA had matched and the person who killed Marise. Once he found those common ancestors, he would work forward from them, building out every branch, every descendant, every possible person who could have been in Hazleton, Pennsylvania on March 18, 1964. The work was painstaking and methodical. It required access to birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, and every possible source of genealogical information. Schubert spent hours every day for months building this tree. He would follow one branch, documenting every child, every marriage, every move from one city to another. He would cross-reference different sources to verify information. He would track down distant relatives and contact them for information about family history. Some branches of the tree dead-ended quickly. Maybe that line of the family had moved to California in the 1950s and couldn't have been in Pennsylvania in 1964. Other branches required extensive investigation. Maybe there were 3 brothers who all stayed in the Hazleton area, any one of whom could potentially be the killer. While Schubert was building the family tree, Pennsylvania State Police investigators were simultaneously doing traditional police work. They were following up on the names Schubert identified, checking alibis, reviewing old case files, seeing who had been interviewed back in 1964 and who had been cleared and who had raised red flags. It was a collaborative effort, with Schubert providing genealogical expertise and investigators providing law enforcement perspective. They would meet regularly to discuss progress, share information, and strategize about next steps. Schubert would identify potential suspects based on the family tree, and investigators would check them out. Some could be quickly eliminated. They had died before 1964, or they were the wrong age, or they lived in a different state. Others required more extensive investigation. Slowly, methodically, the list of possible suspects narrowed. They went from hundreds of potential relatives down to dozens, and then down to a handful. Every name that was eliminated brought them one step closer to the truth. Every branch of the family tree that dead-ended meant there were fewer possibilities to investigate. After nearly 2 years of work, they finally had 4 names. 4 men who fit the DNA profile, who would have been the right age in 1964, who had connections to Hazleton. 4 men who could potentially be Marise's killer. And one of those names was James Paul Forte. James Paul Forte was 22 years old in March of 1964. He lived in Hazleton, just 6 or 7 blocks away from Marise Chiverella and her family. There's no evidence that he knew Marise or that their families had any connection, but in a small town like Hazleton, everyone lived within a few blocks of everyone else. Paths crossed constantly. You saw the same people at the store, at church, walking down the street. Forte was working as a bartender at a local establishment in 1964. By all accounts, he was just another guy living an unremarkable life in a Pennsylvania coal town. He served drinks, told jokes, made small talk with customers. Nobody would have suspected that behind that ordinary exterior was someone capable of raping and murdering a 9-year-old girl. But what investigators discovered about James Paul Forte would paint a picture of a man who had been hiding his true nature for his entire life. When they dug into his background, they found a history of violence and sexual assault that had somehow been overlooked or minimized by the system. Forte had been in reform school as a young man for sexually assaulting girls. This should have been a red flag, a warning sign that he posed a danger to others. But either the records weren't available, or investigators in 1964 didn't have access to them or didn't connect Forte to those earlier crimes. He had served in the army but was dishonorably discharged. Again, this was a potential indicator of problems, of someone who couldn't follow rules or who had engaged in misconduct serious enough to warrant expulsion from the military. Most disturbing of all, Forte had been convicted of attempted murder at some point and had spent time in Eastern State Penitentiary, one of Pennsylvania's most notorious prisons. How someone with this kind of violent criminal history was living freely in Hazleton in 1964 raises serious questions about how the justice system failed to protect the community. But the most damning evidence of Forte's dangerousness came from what happened after Marise's murder. In 1974, 10 years after Marise was killed, James Paul Forte was arrested and charged with rape and sexual assault in an unrelated case. The details of that case showed that Forte had a pattern of sexual violence, that Marise likely wasn't his only victim. And here's where the system failed catastrophically. Forte was given a plea deal. He pled guilty to the lesser charge of aggravated assault and was sentenced to just 1 year of probation. 1 year of probation for rape and sexual assault. Then he was back out in the community, free to harm again. In 1978, he was arrested once more, this time on charges of reckless endangerment and harassment. Again, there were no serious consequences. Forte continued his life in Hazleton, working at the bar, living alone. In May of 1980, James Paul Forte died of a reported heart attack at the bar where he worked. He was just 39 years old. He took whatever secrets he had to his grave, or so everyone thought. When investigators identified Forte as a suspect in Marise's murder, they faced a unique challenge. How do you prove that a man who has been dead for over 40 years committed a crime? The DNA evidence pointed to someone in Forte's family line, but they needed to be absolutely certain. They needed definitive proof that it was James Paul Forte specifically who had killed Marise. There was only one way to get that proof. They needed to test Forte's own DNA. In January of 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police obtained permission to exhume James Paul Forte's remains. This is not a decision that's made lightly. Exhuming a body requires court approval, and judges want to see compelling evidence that the exhumation is necessary and likely to yield useful results. Investigators had to present their case to a judge, explaining how they had identified Forte through genetic genealogy, showing how he fit the profile of the killer, demonstrating that he had the means and opportunity to commit the crime. They had to convince the judge that there was probable cause to believe Forte was the murderer and that testing his DNA was the only way to confirm this. The judge granted the request, and in the cold of January 2022, nearly 58 years after Marise's murder, Forte's grave was opened. Forensic technicians carefully extracted tissue samples from his remains. Despite being buried for over 40 years, the body had preserved well enough that viable DNA could be recovered. The samples were sent to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab for analysis. This was the moment of truth. If Forte's DNA matched the DNA from Marise's jacket, they would have definitive proof that he was her killer. If it didn't match, they would be back to square one, with 3 other potential suspects to investigate. The wait for the results felt interminable. Crime lab technicians worked carefully and methodically, extracting DNA from the tissue samples, amplifying it, analyzing it. They ran the tests multiple times to ensure accuracy. This was too important to get wrong. And then the results came back. The DNA from James Paul Forte's exhumed remains was a perfect match to the DNA that had been collected from Marise Chiverella's jacket in 1964. 58 years after that brutal murder, investigators finally had their answer. James Paul Forte had raped and murdered 9-year-old Marise Ann Chiverella on March 18, 1964. On February 10, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference to announce that they had identified Marise's killer. The room was packed with current and retired investigators, including the trooper who had first investigated Marise's murder back in 1964, now an elderly man who had waited decades to see this case solved. Marise's 4 siblings were there, all of them now in their 60s and 70s, all of them about to hear the name of their sister's killer for the first time. The weight of 58 years hung in the air. This was the moment they had been waiting for their entire adult lives. Corporal Mark Barron stepped up to the microphone. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "This is a very important day for our department," he said. "Even though it took nearly 58 years for this case to be solved, I think this should instill in families of victims across the state and across the country a sense of hope. And that hope is that no matter how long it may take, we as law enforcement will never give up in trying to find the perpetrators of these heinous crimes." Barron identified James Paul Forte as Marise's killer. He explained how genetic genealogy had led them to Forte, how Eric Schubert had helped build the family tree that narrowed down the suspects, and how the exhumation had confirmed what the evidence had been telling them. This was believed to be the 4th oldest cold case in the United States to be solved using genetic genealogy, Barron said, and the oldest in Pennsylvania. He talked about how Marise's case had changed Hazleton, how it had ushered in a new era of fear and caution, how parents had told their children Marise's story for decades as a warning about the dangers that could lurk even in small towns. He spoke about how the community had been haunted by this unsolved murder for nearly 60 years and how it felt to finally be able to give them, and most importantly, Marise's family, answers. Barron's emotion was palpable. "Detectives are taught not to get emotionally attached to cases," he acknowledged, "but you can't help it. It's a vivid memory for everybody who lived through this," he said. "It's a vivid memory for everybody who grew up in this area. And what happened to Marise ushered in a change in this community. Whether you like it or not, the way you lived changed after March 18th of 1964 in Hazleton." Then it was the family's turn to speak. Carmen Marie Radka, Marise's sister, stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face. After 58 years of not knowing, after decades of questions and uncertainty and grief, she was finally about to address the public with the name of her sister's killer. "Marise was sweet and shy," Carmen said, her voice breaking. "She was learning to play the organ, and she aspired to be a nun. We have so many precious memories of Marise, and at the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence." She paused, gathering herself, and continued. "We will continue to ask ourselves what would have been, what could have been." There wasn't a dry eye in that room. Everyone understood that while justice had finally been served, while the killer's name had finally been revealed, there was no bringing Marise back. There was no undoing 58 years of grief and loss and unanswered questions. The family could finally have closure, but that closure came with the bitter recognition that they had lost their sister, their daughter, forever. Kay Talanka, Marise's younger sister, also spoke. She explained how the family had lived with uncertainty for so long that it had become a part of who they were, a shadow that touched every day of their lives. The not knowing had been, in some ways, worse than knowing. At least now they could stop wondering. At least now they could stop imagining different scenarios. At least now they knew the truth. The siblings thanked the Pennsylvania State Police for never giving up on their sister's case. They thanked Corporal Barron specifically for his dedication and perseverance. They thanked Eric Schubert for using his skills to help solve the case. And they expressed hope that other families dealing with unsolved murders might someday experience what they were experiencing, the bittersweet relief of finally having answers. Eric Schubert also spoke at the press conference. At just 22 years old now, he stood before the media and law enforcement professionals with remarkable poise and humility. He talked about how honored he was to have been able to help solve Marise's case, and he encouraged other law enforcement agencies to consider using genetic genealogy for their cold cases. I was pleasantly surprised when the Pennsylvania State Police accepted my offer to help, Schubert said. Agencies don't typically work with outside civilians, especially not college students. But they put their trust in me, and we worked together for 2 years. This shows what can be accomplished when law enforcement is willing to collaborate with experts who have specialized skills. Schubert was careful to deflect credit back to the investigators. He emphasized that while he had built the family tree, it was the Pennsylvania State Police who had done the hard work of following up on leads, checking alibis, reviewing evidence, and ultimately identifying Forte as the killer. The genetic genealogy had provided a roadmap, but it still required traditional detective work to follow that map to its destination. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Brutowski, representing the Pennsylvania State Police, praised Schubert's work and acknowledged that without his expertise and dedication, they might never have identified Forte as the suspect. "This case demonstrates the power of collaboration," Brutowski said. "We recognized that Eric had skills we didn't have, and we were willing to work with him. That willingness to think outside traditional law enforcement structures made all the difference." Brutowski also reflected on the decades of work that had gone into the case. "For the first 40-plus years, we worked this case with old-fashioned police work," he said. "We went out to interview people. We sent teletypes. We interviewed other people. It went word of mouth. We never stopped looking for the person who killed that little girl. And then technology caught up. And we were able to use that technology because investigators back in 1964 had the foresight to preserve the evidence." The press conference revealed some additional details about the investigation and about James Paul Forte that painted a fuller picture of the crime and the killer. Investigators believed the attack on Marise was random. There was no evidence that Forte knew her or her family. He likely spotted her that cold March morning as she was walking to the church, saw a vulnerable child alone on the street, and saw an opportunity. This randomness made the crime even more chilling. Marise hadn't been targeted specifically. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she had encountered a predator who took advantage of that. Forte had never married and had never had any known children. He had lived his entire adult life in the Hazleton area, working at various bars, living in modest apartments, keeping to himself outside of work. To the people who knew him, he was just a regular guy, maybe a little quiet, maybe a little odd, but nothing that would set off alarm bells. After his 1974 arrest for sexual assault, Forte had received only probation, which meant he had remained free to walk the streets of Hazleton for another 6 years, until his death. This raised disturbing questions. Were there other victims? Was Marise his first victim, or had there been others before her? Were there victims after her, women or girls who had suffered at Forte's hands, but whose cases were never connected to him? Investigators acknowledged that they might never know the full extent of Forte's crimes. He had been dead for 42 years by the time he was identified as Marise's killer. Any other victims who might have come forward back in 1980, any evidence that might have connected him to other crimes, was long lost. The passage of time had erased those potential leads. The fact that Forte had died of a heart attack at just 39 years old was another twist in the story. Some might say he escaped justice by dying before he could be caught. Others might see his early death as its own form of justice. Regardless, his death meant he would never face trial, never be forced to confront Marise's family, never have to answer for what he did. The resolution of Marise's case sent ripples far beyond Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Cold case investigators across the country took notice. The case was covered by national news outlets, crime podcasts, true crime YouTube channels. Suddenly, people who had never heard of Hazleton, who had never heard of Marise and Chiverella, were learning about her case and about how it was solved. For families of other victims, Marise's case represented hope. If a case that was 58 years old could be solved, if investigators could reach back through nearly 6 decades to identify a killer, then maybe their cases could be solved too. Maybe the evidence from their loved one's murder, carefully preserved in some evidence storage facility, could yield DNA that would lead to answers. Cold case units across the country began reviewing their oldest unsolved cases, looking for evidence that might contain DNA. Cases that had been considered unsolvable were suddenly being reopened. Families who had given up hope were receiving phone calls from detectives saying they were taking a fresh look. The genetic genealogy technique that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer and solve Marise's case was being applied to case after case. By 2022, hundreds of cold cases had been solved using this method. Killers who thought they had gotten away with murder decades ago were suddenly being identified and, if still alive, arrested and prosecuted. The technique wasn't foolproof. It required that someone related to the perpetrator had uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy database, and it required extensive genealogical work to narrow down suspects. But when it worked, it was incredibly powerful. It could turn a genetic fingerprint into an actual name, could reach back through time to deliver justice that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The case of Marise and Chiverella teaches us several important lessons about criminal investigation, justice, and the human capacity for perseverance. First and foremost, the case demonstrates the critical importance of evidence preservation. If investigators in 1964 hadn't carefully collected and stored DNA evidence from Marise's jacket, this case would never have been solved. They couldn't have known that DNA technology would be developed decades later. They couldn't have predicted that genetic genealogy would become a powerful investigative tool. But they followed proper evidence collection procedures, and they made sure that everything was properly preserved. This should be a lesson to every law enforcement agency in the country. You never know when that critical piece of evidence might become useful. Cases should never be destroyed or discarded just because years have passed. Evidence should be maintained indefinitely because technology continues to evolve, and what seems impossible to analyze today might be routine tomorrow. Second, the case shows that cold cases should never be abandoned. Marise's family waited 58 years for answers, and they deserved those answers. Every family in their position deserves the same. Cold case units need adequate funding and staffing. Investigators need to be given the time and resources to work these cases, even when years have passed, even when the trail has gone cold. There's sometimes a tendency to focus on current cases, on crimes that just happened, on leads that are fresh and hot. That's understandable. There's urgency to recent crimes. But the families of victims from decades ago feel the same urgency. Their pain hasn't diminished with time. If anything, it's grown more acute, more desperate, as years turn into decades and they watch their own lives pass without ever knowing what happened to their loved one. Third, the case demonstrates the power of collaboration. The Pennsylvania State Police could have rejected Eric Schubert's offer to help. They could have insisted on handling everything internally, as law enforcement agencies often do. But they recognized that Schubert had skills they didn't have. Specialized genealogical expertise that would be crucial to solving the case, and they were willing to work with him. This willingness to collaborate, to think outside traditional law enforcement structures, to accept help from unconventional sources, made all the difference. It suggests that other agencies should be similarly open to collaboration, whether it's with genetic genealogists, with academic researchers, with citizen volunteers, or with anyone else who might have relevant expertise. Fourth, the case reminds us that justice is patient. James Paul Forte lived for 16 years after killing Marise. He died thinking he had gotten away with murder. But justice had a longer memory than he did. Nearly 4 decades after his death, his name was revealed to the world as a child killer. His legacy is now forever tainted. Everyone who knew him, everyone who worked with him, everyone who had a drink at his bar now knows what he was. There's something profound about that, about the idea that you can't escape accountability forever, that truth has a way of emerging eventually, that secrets buried in the ground can still be uncovered. Forte thought his secret was safe in the grave. He was wrong. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the case teaches us that victims matter. Marise Ann Chiverella mattered. Her life had value. Her dreams had worth. The fact that investigators never gave up on her case, that they kept working it for 58 years, that they used cutting-edge technology to finally identify her killer, all of that sends a powerful message. Every victim deserves justice. Every family deserves answers. No case is too old to solve. No victim should be forgotten. The use of genetic genealogy to solve crimes has sparked important debates about privacy and civil liberties. When people upload their DNA to genealogy websites like GeneMatch or Family Tree DNA, they're typically doing so to learn about their ancestry, to find distant relatives, to build family trees. They're not expecting their genetic information to be used by law enforcement to solve crimes. Moreover, when you upload your DNA to these sites, you're not just exposing your own genetic information, you're potentially exposing your entire family tree. Distant relatives who never consented to have their DNA used for anything, who may not even know you exist, can suddenly find themselves connected to criminal investigations simply because they share ancestry with a perpetrator. This raises complex ethical and legal questions. Do people have a right to genetic privacy? Should law enforcement be allowed to use public genealogy databases without a warrant? Should there be restrictions on how this technology is used? What about the innocent relatives who get caught up in these investigations? There are no easy answers to these questions. On one hand, people who upload their DNA to public databases are making a choice to share that information publicly. The databases are called public for a reason. Anyone can access them. If law enforcement uses publicly available information to solve crimes, is that really a privacy violation? On the other hand, most people uploading DNA to these sites don't fully understand the implications. They don't realize that by doing so, they might be exposing their cousins, their siblings, their parents to criminal investigations. They don't realize that their genetic information could be used to track down a relative who committed a crime decades ago. Some genealogy websites have responded to these concerns by implementing stricter privacy policies or allowing users to opt out of law enforcement searches. Others have embraced the use of their databases for criminal investigations, seeing it as a way to help solve serious crimes and bring justice to victims. The legal framework around this issue is still evolving. Courts are grappling with questions about whether using genetic genealogy constitutes a search under the Fourth Amendment, whether warrants should be required, what limitations should be placed on the technique. Different jurisdictions are developing different rules, creating a patchwork of regulations that can be confusing and inconsistent. Despite these concerns, there's widespread public support for using genetic genealogy to solve violent crimes, especially murders of children. In the case of Marise Chiverella, few would argue that the use of genetic genealogy was inappropriate. A 9-year-old girl was raped and murdered. Her family deserved answers. James Paul Forte's DNA was at the crime scene. Connecting him to that DNA through his distant relatives and through Eric Schubert's genealogical work was simply good investigative technique. The challenge is figuring out where to draw the line. If genetic genealogy is acceptable for child murders, what about other violent crimes? What about property crimes? What about identifying suspects in protests or other political activities? These are questions that society is still working through, trying to balance the need for justice with the right to privacy. Today, more than 60 years after her death, Marise Ann Chiverella is remembered not just as a victim, but as a little girl with dreams and aspirations, with kindness and faith, with a whole life that should have been lived. Her case changed Hazleton forever. The town that had once felt safe and insulated learned that evil could strike anywhere. Parents became more cautious. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted. The innocence of that era, when kids roamed free and neighbors trusted each other and small towns felt protected from the dangers of the outside world, was shattered. But Marise's case also demonstrated the best of humanity. The investigators who never gave up, the family who never stopped hoping, the young genealogist who used his skills to help, the community that remembered and cared. For 58 years, people who never knew Marise personally carried her story with them, told it to their children, used it as a cautionary tale, but also as a reminder that some things should never be forgotten. The resolution of her case brought a kind of closure, but it also opened new wounds. Finally knowing who killed Marise meant confronting the reality that it was someone from their own community, someone who had walked among them, someone who had served them drinks and told them jokes. James Paul Forte wasn't a stranger from out of town. He was a neighbor, living just blocks away from the Chiverella family, hiding in plain sight. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case, the ordinariness of the killer. Forte wasn't a monster with horns and fangs. He was just a guy, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of person you wouldn't look at twice. And that's terrifying because it means that predators can be anyone, can look like anyone, can blend in to any community. The location where Marise's body was found, that abandoned coal mining pit, is a reminder of Hazleton's industrial past. Coal mining shaped that region for generations, provided jobs, built communities, but also left behind scars in the landscape. Marise was found in one of those scars, in a place that represented both the source of the community's livelihood and the wounds that industry left behind. Today, Hazleton has changed, like many former coal mining towns in Pennsylvania. The mines are mostly closed. The industry has moved on. But the community remembers. They remember March 18, 1964. They remember Marise Ann Chiverella. They remember how her death changed everything. Now they can remember her with the knowledge of who killed her. They can remember her not just as a victim, but as a little girl who loved music and wanted to be a nun, and who was kind enough to carry canned goods to her church on a cold Wednesday morning. James Paul Forte died in 1980 at the age of 39. He never faced justice for what he did to Marise. He never spent a day in prison for her murder. He never had to look her family in the eye and explain himself. In some ways, that feels like he got away with it, like he escaped accountability. But in another way, justice caught up with him anyway. His name is now forever linked to one of the most notorious crimes in Pennsylvania history. His legacy is not the jokes he told behind the bar or the drinks he served, but the innocent life he destroyed, the family he devastated, the community he traumatized. That's a different kind of justice, but it's justice nonetheless. For the investigators who worked Marise's case over the decades, the resolution represents the culmination of nearly 60 years of effort. Some of those investigators passed away, never knowing who killed Marise. Others retired without seeing the case solved. Some spent years of their lives pursuing leads that went nowhere, following tips that didn't pan out, watching technology slowly catch up to the evidence they had preserved. Corporal Mark Barron, who led the final push to identify Forte, carried the weight not just of Marise's case, but of all those investigators who came before him. When he choked up at that press conference, when his voice cracked with emotion, it was because he understood that he was speaking not just for himself, but for generations of investigators who had refused to give up. The retired trooper who had first responded to the scene in 1964 was present at the 2022 press conference. He was an elderly man now, but he remembered that day vividly. The cold, the horror of finding a child's body, the devastation of the family, the determination to find who had done this. For 58 years, he had wondered if he would ever see the case solved. Now, near the end of his own life, he finally had that answer. There's something deeply moving about that continuity, about the young trooper in 1964 becoming the elderly man in 2022, about the case that had defined part of his career finally being resolved, about the promise he had made to Marise's family decades ago finally being kept. It speaks to the dedication of law enforcement professionals who see their work not as a job but as a calling, who make promises to victims and their families and then spend lifetimes trying to keep those promises. The success in solving Marise's case has opened doors for Eric Schubert and other genetic genealogists. Since the press conference, Schubert has been contacted by multiple law enforcement agencies asking for help with their cold cases. What had been a side project for a college student has become a potential career path, a way to use his passion for genealogy to help bring justice to victims and closure to families. Schubert represents a new generation of cold case investigators, people who bring different skills and perspectives to these old cases, who can see solutions that traditional investigators might have missed. His youth, rather than being a liability, was an asset. He had grown up with technology, was comfortable with databases and online research, approached problems with fresh eyes, unconstrained by the way things have always been done. His collaboration with the Pennsylvania State Police has become a model for other agencies. More and more, law enforcement is recognizing that solving complex cases requires bringing in experts with specialized skills, whether that's genetic genealogists, forensic accountants, digital forensic specialists, or any number of other professionals who can contribute unique expertise. This trend toward collaboration is changing the landscape of criminal investigation. The stereotype of the lone detective working a case solo is giving way to teams of specialists working together, each contributing their own piece of the puzzle. And that collaborative approach is solving cases that would have been impossible to crack using traditional methods alone. Genetic genealogy continues to evolve and improve. The databases are getting larger as more people upload their DNA. The techniques for building family trees are becoming more sophisticated. The software tools available to genealogists are becoming more powerful. What took Eric Schubert 2 years to accomplish in Marise's case might take a few months today. Cases that seemed impossibly distant might now be within reach. As of 2025, hundreds of cold cases have been solved using genetic genealogy. Rapists who thought they were safe have been identified decades later. Murderers who believed they had escaped justice have been tracked down. Families who had given up hope have finally gotten answers. The technology has proven itself again and again, demonstrating its power to reach back through time and deliver justice. But the technology also continues to raise questions and concerns. Privacy advocates worry about the implications of genetic surveillance. Civil libertarians question whether law enforcement should have access to genetic databases without warrants. Ethicists debate the moral implications of using distant relatives' DNA to identify suspects. These are important conversations that need to continue as the technology develops and becomes more widely used. The legal framework is also evolving. Some states have passed laws regulating the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Courts are issuing rulings that clarify what is and isn't permissible. Professional organizations are developing ethical guidelines for genetic genealogists who work with law enforcement. This patchwork of regulations and guidelines will likely continue to develop over the coming years as society grapples with how to balance the benefits of this technology against legitimate privacy concerns. Looking forward, genetic genealogy is likely to solve many more cold cases in the years to come. Evidence that has been sitting in storage facilities for decades is being re-examined. DNA that couldn't be analyzed years ago is now yielding useful profiles. Databases are growing larger, making it more likely that distant relatives of perpetrators can be identified. But there are limits to what the technology can do. It requires that DNA evidence exists and has been preserved. It requires that the DNA is of sufficient quality to generate a useful profile. It requires that someone related to the perpetrator has uploaded their DNA to a public database. It requires skilled genealogists to build accurate family trees. It requires traditional investigators to follow up on leads and confirm identities. When all these factors align, as they did in Marise's case, the results can be remarkable. But not every case will have all these elements in place. There are also cold cases that predate the collection of DNA evidence, cases from the 1950s and earlier, when investigators simply didn't know to look for biological material or didn't have the means to collect and preserve it properly. Those cases may never be solved through genetic genealogy, though other technological advances might someday provide answers. As we close this story, it's important to remember Marise and Chiverella not as a case number or a crime scene photograph, but as a real person, a 9-year-old girl with dreams and hopes, with family who loved her, with a whole life that should have been lived. She wanted to be a nun. Think about that for a moment. At age 9, when most kids are thinking about toys and games and friends, Marise was thinking about dedicating her life to serving God and helping others. She was learning to play the organ. She volunteered to take canned goods to church. She embodied the values her family and her faith had taught her: kindness, service, compassion. That's what makes her murder so particularly heartbreaking. She wasn't just any child. She was a child actively engaged in trying to make the world better, trying to help people, trying to live out her faith in practical ways. And she was taken while doing exactly that, while carrying food to the church, while trying to help the less fortunate. Her siblings carry her memory with them every day. They're in their 70s and 80s now, but they still remember their little sister with the bright smile and the kind heart. They still wonder what she would have become, what she would have accomplished, what kind of woman she would have grown into. They still feel the hole in their family where Marise should be. But now at least they have answers. They know who killed their sister. They know that law enforcement never gave up on her case. They know that even 58 years later, even when it seemed impossible, justice found a way. The case of Marise and Chiverella is a testament to human perseverance, to the power of technology, to the importance of never giving up on victims. It's a reminder that evil exists, that innocent children can fall prey to predators, that tragedy can strike anywhere. But it's also a reminder that good exists too, that there are people who dedicate their lives to seeking justice, that there are families who never give up hope, that there are technological advances that can reach back through time to expose the truth. 58 years is a long time to wait for justice. It's longer than many people's entire lives. Marise's parents didn't live to see her killer identified. Many of the investigators who worked her case in the early years never got to see it solved. But the case was never forgotten, the evidence was never discarded, and ultimately, the truth emerged. That should give hope to every family dealing with an unsolved murder. No case is too old to solve. No victim should be forgotten. Technology continues to advance, investigators continue to work, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, justice prevails. Marise and Chiverella, may you rest in peace knowing that the world finally knows your story, that your killer's name has been revealed, that you have not been forgotten. You wanted to serve others, and, in a way, your case has served others, showing that cold cases can be solved, giving hope to other families, demonstrating what's possible when dedication meets technology meets determination. To the investigators who worked this case over decades, thank you for never giving up. To Eric Schubert, thank you for using your skills to help bring closure. To Marise's family, may you finally have the peace that comes with knowing the truth. And to anyone reading this story, remember that victims matter, that justice is worth pursuing no matter how much time has passed. and that sometimes, against all odds, the bad guys are caught and the truth is revealed. The 58-year wait for justice is finally over.